Picture this. Deep inside a cave in what is now southern Germany, a research team in the 1930s uncovers hundreds of small ivory fragments scattered across the cave floor, broken and mixed with sediment. They box them up, catalog them, and basically forget about them for decades, because nobody realizes what they're actually looking at. Then, decades later, someone finally sits down and painstakingly reassembles those fragments like the world's most stressful, high-stakes jigsaw puzzle. And what emerges stops everyone in the room cold. A carved ivory figure standing roughly a foot tall with the unmistakable body of a human and the unmistakable head of a lion. It's not a rough scratch on a cave wall, it's a fully three-dimensional sculpture, carved with obvious skill, dated to around 40,000 years ago. And to this day, nobody can definitively explain why an ancient human spent what was likely hundreds of hours of painstaking labor creating it. So let's dig into the strange, still unsolved case of humanity's oldest known figurative artwork, and why, even with all our modern archaeology and analysis, this particular ancient creation still refuses to fully give up its secrets. Let's start with the basics, because understanding exactly why this object is so baffling requires appreciating just how technically demanding it actually was to produce. This figure, commonly known today as the Lion Man, was carved from a single piece of mammoth ivory, using nothing but stone tools. Mammoth ivory isn't some soft, easily workable material either. It's dense, it splits unpredictably along natural grain lines, and carving it into a coherent, detailed, three-dimensional figure requires mastery of the material's specific properties. Researchers who have studied the piece closely estimate that creating it likely required several hundred hours of careful, patient work, meaning whoever made this wasn't just killing an idle afternoon. This was a deliberate, sustained, enormously time-consuming project undertaken by someone with serious carving skill and, more importantly, a serious reason for doing it. Here's where things start getting strange. 40,000 years ago places this creation firmly within a period when ancient humans were still primarily focused on immediate survival, hunting large, dangerous game, managing fire, constructing shelter against brutal Ice Age conditions. Every single one of these tasks demanded significant time and energy just to keep a small community alive through each passing season. And yet somehow, within this demanding survival context, someone found, or perhaps more accurately, made, the time to spend hundreds of hours creating an object that provided no direct nutritional, protective, or obviously practical survival benefit whatsoever. This immediately raises the central question that has kept researchers debating for decades. Why did this matter enough to justify that kind of investment? Let's consider the most straightforward theoretical explanation first, since it's worth ruling out the simple answers before diving into the puzzling ones. Could this simply be decorative art, created purely for aesthetic enjoyment, similar to how a modern person might paint a picture simply because they find the process satisfying? This explanation, while plausible on the surface, runs into a significant problem once you consider the specific choice of subject matter. If this were purely decorative art created for casual aesthetic pleasure, you'd generally expect considerably more variety in ancient European art from this same broad time period. More animals, more human figures, more everyday scenes. Instead, this particular hybrid creature, part human, part predator, appears to represent something considerably more deliberate and symbolically loaded than casual decorative choice would typically suggest. This brings us toward the theory that generates the most excitement, and honestly the most legitimate scientific debate, among researchers studying ancient symbolic behavior. Many archaeologists believe this figure represents evidence of early spiritual or shamanistic belief, potentially depicting a therianthrope, meaning a being that exists partly as human and partly as animal, a concept that appears repeatedly across countless later human mythologies and religious traditions throughout recorded history. If this interpretation holds up, and there's compelling circumstantial evidence supporting it, this object might represent one of the earliest known physical expressions of abstract spiritual thinking in the entire archaeological record, predating virtually every other confirmed example of organized ritual behavior we've discovered anywhere else. Let's sit with that for a moment, because it's a significant claim worth taking seriously rather than glossing over quickly. If ancient humans 40,000 years ago were already conceptualizing beings that blended human and animal identity, beings that existed somewhere between the physical, everyday world, and something considerably more abstract or supernatural, This suggests a level of cognitive and symbolic sophistication that some researchers previously assumed developed considerably later in human history. This single carved object potentially pushes back our entire timeline for when ancient humans first began engaging with abstract religious or spiritual concepts, which is precisely why this particular artifact continues generating serious scholarly attention decades after its initial discovery. Now, here's something worth exploring regarding why the specific combination of human and lion anatomy matters so much toward this interpretation. Cave lions, as we've discussed extensively in previous explorations, represented one of the most dangerous, formidable predators ancient humans regularly encountered throughout this same general period and region. Choosing to specifically merge human form with exactly this particular predator, rather than some smaller, less threatening animal, suggests deliberate symbolic intention rather than random creative whim. Some researchers propose this figure might represent a kind of spiritual mediator or protector, a being capable of channeling the raw power and predatory capability of the cave lion while still maintaining human identity and human intention, essentially embodying a fusion of humanity's greatest physical vulnerability alongside its greatest imagined protective strength. Others propose a somewhat different, though related, interpretation centered around shamanistic transformation specifically. Many documented traditional societies throughout more recent human history described spiritual practitioners, shamans, who were believed capable of transforming into animal form during trance states or spiritual journeys, gaining access toward animal senses, strength, or supernatural insight unavailable through purely human perception. If ancient humans 40,000 years ago already held comparable beliefs regarding human-animal spiritual transformation, this figure might represent a physical, tangible depiction of exactly that kind of transformative spiritual journey, essentially serving as an early visual representation of a shamanic figure caught mid-transformation between human and lion identity. Let's talk about something fascinating regarding where exactly this figure was discovered, since location often provides crucial contextual clues that help researchers narrow down plausible interpretation. This particular object was found deep within a cave, in a location that required deliberate, difficult travel to reach rather than sitting near an easily accessible cave entrance where ordinary daily activity would naturally occur. This positioning strongly suggests the object wasn't simply decorative furniture sitting within someone's everyday living space. Its deliberately remote placement, deep within challenging cave terrain, suggests ceremonial or ritual significance, since ancient humans generally didn't undertake difficult, potentially dangerous cave exploration without meaningful purpose driving that specific choice. This detail matters enormously toward the broader interpretive puzzle because it suggests this figure likely wasn't intended for casual, everyday viewing by anyone who happened to wander past. Instead, encountering this object probably required deliberate, purposeful travel deep into cave darkness, possibly as part of some kind of ceremonial pilgrimage or ritual practice reserved specifically for certain individuals or certain significant occasions. Imagine the psychological weight of that kind of deliberate journey, moving deeper and deeper into cave darkness, torch flickering, eventually arriving at a carefully placed carved figure depicting this strange, powerful human-lion hybrid being. Whatever this object's exact original purpose, its physical placement alone tells us it carried ceremonial weight, rather than functioning as simple household decoration. Now let's examine something worth appreciating regarding the sheer technical skill this creation required, since this detail actually opens up an entirely separate, equally fascinating avenue of scientific inquiry. Researchers who have carefully studied the carving technique used throughout this figure note remarkably sophisticated understanding of ivory's specific physical properties, including careful consideration regarding grain direction, strategic planning regarding how to avoid natural material weaknesses during the carving process, and confident, controlled tool handling throughout the entire lengthy creation process. This level of technical mastery doesn't simply appear from nowhere. It suggests an established, ongoing carving tradition, meaning this particular Lion Man figure likely wasn't some isolated, unprecedented creative outburst, but rather represented the culmination of considerable accumulated skill and knowledge that had probably been developing and refining within this specific ancient community across a meaningful span of time beforehand. This raises an interesting question worth pondering. If sophisticated ivory carving tradition existed within this ancient community well enough to produce something this technically accomplished, where are the other examples? Why haven't we discovered a broader collection of comparable objects reflecting this same skilled artistic tradition across multiple different creators or multiple different time periods? Some researchers suggest this apparent scarcity simply reflects the difficulty of long-term ivory preservation, combined with the sheer rarity of undisturbed ancient sites surviving intact across 40,000 years of subsequent geological and environmental change. Others wonder whether this particular figure might represent something unique even within its own original context, perhaps created by an unusually skilled individual specifically for an unusually significant occasion, rather than reflecting broader, more common creative practice throughout the wider community. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's dig into something worth considering regarding gender and identity within this figure too, since this detail adds yet another interesting layer toward the ongoing scholarly debate. Careful anatomical analysis of the figure has produced some disagreement among researchers regarding whether specific physical details suggest a male or female representation, or possibly an intentionally ambiguous or dual-gendered depiction that doesn't neatly correspond toward either straightforward category. If this ambiguity reflects deliberate artistic choice rather than simple interpretive uncertainty on our part today, it potentially adds further support toward the spiritual transformation theory, since many documented traditional shamanistic and spiritual traditions throughout later human history specifically emphasize transcendence beyond ordinary binary categories, including gender, as part of achieving spiritual or supernatural status. Now here's something worth appreciating regarding just how much scientific effort has gone into simply reconstructing this object properly, since the story of its physical restoration is almost as fascinating as the object itself. Remember those original fragments discovered scattered across the cave floor back in the 1930s? The initial excavation and reconstruction effort actually produced a noticeably incomplete, somewhat crude assembly, missing several key pieces and lacking full confidence regarding the figure's precise original proportions and details. It wasn't until decades later, when researchers returned toward the original excavation site and conducted considerably more thorough, careful, additional excavation, that hundreds of additional small ivory fragments were finally recovered, allowing for a dramatically more accurate, complete reconstruction of the figure's true original appearance. This multi-decade reconstruction process reveals something worth appreciating regarding how challenging ancient archaeological interpretation actually is, even when dealing with an object this significant and this thoroughly studied. Researchers essentially spent years working with an incomplete, potentially misleading version of this artifact before finally achieving something closer toward its actual original form. This raises a humbling question worth sitting with. If it took researchers this long, using modern scientific technique and careful, patient effort, simply to physically reconstruct what this object actually looked like, how much additional uncertainty remains regarding its actual original meaning and purpose? Information that, unlike physical fragments, wasn't scattered across a cave floor waiting to eventually be rediscovered and carefully pieced back together. Let's touch on something worth exploring regarding radiocarbon dating, and exactly how researchers determined this figure's ancient age, since precise dating carries enormous weight toward understanding its broader historical and cultural significance. Dating organic material. This old requires careful analysis of associated sediment layers and organic material found alongside the figure itself, since directly dating ivory carries its own technical challenges and limitations. Current dating estimates place this figure's creation somewhere around 40,000 years ago, though ongoing refinement of dating techniques occasionally produces small adjustments toward this estimate as methodology continues improving over time. This dating places the Lion Man figure within a fascinating period of ancient human history, roughly coinciding with when anatomically modern humans were expanding into and establishing themselves throughout various regions of Europe, encountering entirely new environments, new predator species, and quite possibly encountering other, now extinct human relative species during this same general period as well. This broader historical context adds weight toward understanding why this particular moment in ancient human history might have produced exactly this kind of symbolically complex, technically ambitious creative expression, since periods of significant environmental and social transition often correlate throughout later documented human history, with increased development of meaningful, symbolic, and spiritual practice specifically designed to help communities process and make sense of significant life changes and challenges. Now let's consider something worth pondering regarding what this object's continued mystery actually reveals about the fundamental limits of archaeological interpretation more broadly. Unlike many other categories of ancient artifact, stone tools whose function seems reasonably obvious from their physical design, structural remains whose purpose can be reasonably inferred from their layout and construction. This particular object exists specifically within the difficult category of symbolic, meaning-laden creation, where physical examination alone, however careful and sophisticated, simply cannot fully recover the actual thoughts, beliefs, and intentions of the specific person who originally created it 40,000 years ago. This represents an important limitation worth appreciating honestly rather than glossing over with confident-sounding but ultimately speculative explanation. We can analyze carving technique. We can examine material composition. We can study precise physical placement within the original discovery site. We can compare this object against later, better documented human spiritual and symbolic tradition. But we cannot, no matter how sophisticated our modern analytical technique becomes, directly access the actual internal thoughts and beliefs of the specific ancient individual who spent hundreds of hours carefully carving this figure. This represents a permanent evidentiary gap that simply cannot be fully closed through physical archaeological analysis alone, regardless of how much additional technological advancement future research eventually achieves. Let's briefly acknowledge something worth appreciating regarding why this particular kind of irreducible mystery actually makes this object considerably more interesting rather than less, at least from a certain perspective worth considering. Plenty of ancient artifacts carry reasonably confident, well-supported interpretation based on comparative evidence and contextual analysis. This particular figure, by contrast, sits stubbornly at the edge of what archaeological method can definitively determine, forcing researchers toward openly acknowledge uncertainty rather than defaulting toward confident, tidy explanation that might feel more satisfying, but wouldn't reflect the actual current state of scientific understanding regarding this specific object's true original purpose and meaning. Now here's something worth exploring regarding how this particular mystery connects toward broader questions regarding ancient human cognitive and symbolic development more generally. If this figure does represent early evidence of abstract spiritual or shamanistic thinking, as many researchers currently believe based on available evidence, this suggests ancient humans were engaging with sophisticated abstract conceptual thought considerably earlier than some previous theoretical models assumed. This connects directly toward broader ongoing scientific debate regarding exactly when and how ancient human cognitive capacity for abstract symbolic thinking, language development, and complex cultural practice actually emerged and developed throughout our species' long evolutionary history. Let's consider something worth appreciating regarding how rare comparable objects actually are within the broader archaeological record, since this scarcity itself carries interpretive significance worth exploring properly. While ancient humans certainly created other examples of figurative art during roughly comparable time periods, animal carvings, simpler human figures, decorative beadwork, few other discovered objects combine quite this same level of technical sophistication alongside quite this same degree of deliberate symbolic complexity, specifically the intentional fusion of human and animal identity within a single, carefully unified figure. This relative rarity suggests whatever specific belief system or cultural practice originally motivated this particular creation likely wasn't universally common throughout ancient human communities generally, but rather represented something considerably more specific, perhaps localized toward this particular community, or perhaps reflecting an unusually skilled individual creator working within an unusually significant ceremonial context. Let's touch on something worth mentioning regarding ongoing scientific research still actively continuing regarding this remarkable object, since the mystery surrounding it hasn't simply been abandoned as permanently unsolvable. Researchers continue applying newly developed analytical technique towards studying this figure, including detailed microscopic examination of tool marks that might reveal additional information regarding the specific carving sequence and technique used, alongside comparative analysis against newly discovered ancient sites that might eventually provide additional context, helping researchers better understand the broader cultural and symbolic environment this figure originally emerged from. This ongoing research effort means our current understanding, while still incomplete regarding this object's precise original meaning, likely continues gradually improving as scientific methodology and comparative archaeological evidence continues developing further over time. Now let's wrap up by considering something worth appreciating regarding what this entire exploration ultimately reveals about ancient human creativity, symbolic thinking, and the humbling limits of what modern science can definitively recover regarding our species' distant past. This carved figure, painstakingly created from mammoth ivory using nothing but stone tools, deliberately placed deep within challenging cave terrain, representing a sophisticated fusion of human and predator identity, stands today as compelling evidence that ancient humans 40,000 years ago were already engaging with complex, abstract, symbolic, and possibly spiritual thinking considerably earlier than many people might casually assume when picturing ancient human life as purely focused on immediate physical survival alone. Yet despite decades of careful scientific study, sophisticated dating technique, painstaking physical reconstruction, and extensive comparative analysis against later documented human spiritual and symbolic tradition, we still cannot definitively state exactly what this particular ancient human intended this figure toward represent, or exactly what specific ceremonial or spiritual practice originally surrounded its creation and eventual placement deep within that remote cave location. This persistent uncertainty isn't a failure of modern archaeological science. It's an honest, humbling acknowledgement regarding the limits of what physical evidence alone can definitively recover regarding the actual internal thoughts, beliefs, and intentions of specific individuals who lived and created remarkable things tens of thousands of years before any written language existed to help preserve and clarify their original meaning and intention for us today. So what does this ultimately tell us about ancient human creativity and the mysteries still embedded within our species' deep past? It tells us that even our most technologically sophisticated modern scientific analysis cannot fully close every single gap in our understanding regarding ancient human belief and intention, and that some mysteries, however extensively studied and however many brilliant researchers dedicate their careers toward investigating them, may simply remain permanently, irreducibly uncertain. This particular carved figure, sitting quietly today within a museum display case, continues silently holding on to secrets that its original ancient creator, whoever specifically they were, likely never imagined would still be puzzling researchers an entire 40,000 years later. Next time you encounter confident-sounding claims regarding exactly what ancient artifacts definitely meant or definitely represented, remember this particular carved ivory figure. And remember that scientific honesty sometimes requires openly acknowledging uncertainty rather than defaulting toward tidy, satisfying explanation that might feel more comfortable but wouldn't reflect the actual current state of evidence and understanding. Some ancient human creations, however extensively studied, simply continue keeping their original secrets, quietly reminding us that our species' distant past still contains mystery, that modern science, for all its sophistication, hasn't yet fully managed toward completely unravel. If exploring this persistent ancient mystery shifted how you think about the limits of archaeological interpretation and the sophistication of ancient human symbolic thinking, imagine how many other remarkable, still unexplained ancient creations remain waiting throughout museums and ongoing archaeological sites worldwide, quietly holding on to secrets that may never be fully, definitively resolved. Stick around because there are countless additional stories from humanity's ancient past that reveal just how sophisticated, surprisingly mysterious, and remarkably resistant toward complete modern explanation our ancestors' most remarkable creations truly continue toward being, even after decades of dedicated, careful scientific study.